Remember, the content on our show is for information only.
It is not intended to provide medical or other professional advice.
Hello and welcome to Placebo, the show where each week my sister and I try and teach each other something interesting about science or medicine. I'm Logan Richards, and this is my sister.
And I'm Kaylin Richards.
And this week, I noticed on the way over here that I keep seeming to copy your themes of your episodes when I'm doing next week.
Brother.
So, last couple of weeks you did cell phones, and then I did blue light.
Mm-hmm.
And last week you did animal researching. Is that research meaningful? And so I've done a different topic where I've taken a type of research and I want to figure out if it's meaningful.
Okay. What is...
Can you guess what type of research I chose?
Human research. We already did animal. Computer research. We talked about that.
I thought I should...
Genetic research.
Okay, I'll just give it to you.
Okay.
Well, I chose to look into what's been reported recently in the news as an issue with the topic of industry-funded research in food.
Oh, I've seen an
nutrition.
article about that.
Yeah.
Is fat or sugar bad for you? Which is worse?
I think it's
hard to tell.
Yeah. Okay, so here's...
Probably lots of sugar is bad for you, but...
Yeah, well, I think that's common sense at least.
Or a lot
it seems
of fat,
like
yes.
it. So we're going to talk about a few things. What we're going to start with is an article that was published just a few days ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association. JAMA. This article is called Sugar Industry and Coronary Heart Disease Research, a historical analysis of internal industry documents.
I really wish they did a better job with their titling of articles.
You're not blown away by this title?
No, they don't have the catchy headlines that you come to expect from the media.
Okay. Well, it's not clickbait, I guess.
No.
But we'll get into that. I think it's maybe they're doing it on purpose. I'm not sure. So this article is by Kristen Kearns and her team, which are looks like mostly from San Francisco, various research institutes there.
Okay.
And Kristen Kearns is actually a dentist, in case that will shade her view in any way.
She probably doesn't like sugar in particular in that case.
We should set the scene first, because it's interesting and it leads to why this random dentist is the one looking into it. So I guess
is she like a researcher / dentist, or she's just a dentist?
I think so.
That just like...
I don't know the full story, I guess.
Just a personal dentist.
What I saw on NPR was that she was at a dental conference and she went to a talk about dentistry and diabetes. And they were given this pamphlet on things that they could give to their patients. The dentist could give to their patients with diabetes. And she said she was confused because sugar restriction was not mentioned on the pamphlet.
Yeah.
And I don't know anything about the pamphlet. I don't know if they did that on purpose because maybe a dentist can't make nutritional recommendations legally or whatever. But she thought this was silly because it's kind of common sense. You know, sugar is a main cause. Eating too much sugar is a main cause of diabetes.
Yes.
And so she thought,
why
are we not even mentioning this? You know, maybe.
Yeah.
So I guess at that point, she was starting to kind of get interested in this sugar topic of if it's healthy for you. And she was doing research and came across an archive of secret correspondence.
Secret? Is it in code?
No, it was letters that somehow ended up in a university library.
Invisible ink?
No, just letters.
Okay.
I don't know how they ended up in this university library, but they were correspondence between Harvard researchers and these people that worked for the Sugar Association, which I think has had several names and is a company or organization that's still in existence.
Is it like a lobbying group?
Basically, that's what it sounds like. So let's set the scene here. Way back in the 50s and 60s is when all this is taking place. I guess at that time, there was an increase in the amount of coronary heart disease than there had been in the past.
Okay.
And so they wanted to figure out why. And so that's when this sort of research on diet started showing up.
Okay.
And they were particularly interested in this coronary heart disease problem. And so researchers were looking at various causes, including diet, obviously.
That would be my biggest guess for why people are having...
And so at that point, there was several researchers that were coming out with articles that suggested that sugar, they were going even more specific, looking at the various types, sucrose versus fructose, and sugars coming from starches versus carbohydrates and things like that. So there was a growing amount of evidence suggesting that sugar was definitely implicated in the kind of fatty accumulation that happens in the arteries with coronary heart disease.
Which is interesting because I would think that they would be seeing a spike in diabetes or something and not necessarily the spike in coronary heart disease.
Yeah, I guess that has to do with just what they were interested with at the time. Mm-hmm. I don't know. This is what they were looking at. And the way this works is that the Sugar Association was noticing this research, and they had a board meeting or whatever, some type of meeting. Yeah, and they said, well, this is going to affect our industry. So what we should do is, and this article that was posted by Kearns, the lady who I mentioned at the beginning.
The dentist.
Yeah. She's got all sorts of quotes from both, like, it sounds like meeting notes and these letters, which she ended up finding.
Yeah.
So the sugar industry, in their secret board meeting, they were interested. They said, well, we should go look at these studies, figure out what's wrong, if some of them have some methodological errors, and then we'll redo them, and
because we know sugar is the best. It is so healthy, and
yeah,
everyone must have sugar.
So they said, we'll redo them. And,
clearly it was a mistake in the study.
They said this quote here, their goal for looking at the errors and redoing them was that then we can publish the data and refute our detractors.
Yes,
so
okay.
That already sounds somewhat suspect, because when you're doing scientific research, you shouldn't be trying to refute your detractors. You should be trying to
answer a question, and you should be open to whatever the answer turns out to be.
These guys were only open to refuting detractors.
It seems like they already knew what their answer was going to be.
So, anyways, there was a study there was several studies, it looks like about 3, that were published in a journal called the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is still a rather reputable journal, I'd say.
Okay.
Famous. And they were all stating that sugar was definitely implicated in this causing fat in your arteries, and then leading to CHD. Definitely a risk factor. And so then the sugar industry said, we really need to do something about this. So they met together and decided to fund something which has such a boring name. They funded Project 226.
Well, it does sound like a coded project, though. It sounds like a spy project.
Which I didn't go up and look why it was called that, but apparently that's what it's called. Maybe it was the 226th project they worked on. What that ended up being is that they went to these Harvard researchers who, from what I can tell, had either worked on or themselves written parts of the studies that had come out before, the 3 that I told you about that were suggesting sugar was a risk factor. So they went to these researchers and they said, we'd like you to write a review on sugar and this coronary heart disease. Come out with a nice systematic review, and we'll pay you for it. And so they, in the end, paid them about the equivalent of about $50,000 each, which back then was significantly less, of course.
Okay, $50,000 to our today's money.
In 2016 dollars, yeah.
Okay.
So it took them a while, and here's where the letters come in. So from what I can tell, there's no actual evidence that the sugar people really edited the drafts or the actual final product of the this review. Now, the review did come out in favor of sugars were not implicated, and it must be other things. So it was in favor of what the sugar article or the sugar people wanted.
Did they suggest what their results should be?
So there's several letters here. The first was from the researchers saying, well, this is taking much longer because there's all this research about sugar and coronary artery disease, and we need to kind of consider this as it keeps coming out. So there was a bunch of evidence saying that sugar was a risk factor, and they kept having to consider it for their review, like good researchers. But then I'll read you the quote here. Let me get to it. It's a hilarious quote because it's so confusing.
Who wrote it?
So this is from the sugar people to the Harvard researchers. And it was in a letter in 1965. It says, "Our particular interest has to do with the part of nutrition in which there are claims that carbohydrates in the form of sucrose make an inordinate contribution to the metabolic condition, high hereto ascribed to attributions called fat metabolism. I will be disappointed if this aspect is drowned out in the cascade of review and general interpretation." Does that make sense?
Well, yes, but I think they used a few too many words. They needed a little editing in there.
So what I take that to mean is we'd like you to focus on sugar and fat metabolism.
But they didn't say we want to see that it doesn't cause any problems. They just said, please focus on this aspect. Don't ignore it and publish about other aspects instead.
Yeah, I guess. So I think one thing to remember here is we probably don't have all the letters. There are obvious gaps because the scientists then acknowledged, they said, yes, we're well aware that you're interested in this.
Yeah, we do know that you work for the Sugar Board. Like you signed your letter, Sugar Board.
So later, when they're about to publish, the only other letter that this article, the JAMA article, cites is that the sugar people writing to the researchers saying, are we going to receive a draft before you publish it? So it seems like there was some gap there, and they don't have the letters, or they didn't cite them here in this research. But they do send a draft, because then the last letter, a couple days before publishing, is that the sugar people say, we've read it and we really like your results, and we are excited to see it in print, or something like that. So there's no direct evidence that they changed things, but it was clear that they were at least reading the drafts and had made it known what they wanted their results to be.
Now, I don't know if this was the case at the time, but now you have to publish any conflicts of interest.
Yeah, so
at the head of your article.
So that was, at the time, you did not have to publish any funding. From what I can tell, they did publish some funding, but failed to include that the sugar industry, this sugar association, had given them any money.
Because sometimes you read an article about, since I'm an occupational therapist, maybe I read an article about some sort of new technology that people are using in rehab, and the researcher then writes that they are also employed by the company that develops the technology.
Right.
And so I think, I don't really take this 100% seriously then, because clearly they have a motivation to make it sound better than it is, maybe.
Right. And that's where this whole episode is kind of going. So you could kind of see where we went with that there. They put out this review that was heavily favorable for the sugar industry, and that went into the New England Journal of Medicine and kind of became this large, I think it was like a landmark study that kind of influenced a lot of the research from then on. People took it for what it was, for the conclusions, and I think we see that still today. Like I often wonder, I don't know when like skim milk was invented or all these fat-free products.
It was invented a long time ago, but I do think that
popularized
it was
and
popular
seen everywhere.
Like when we were young,
right?
Skim milk was thought to be the healthy choice.
I wonder if all these low-fat things were kind of implicated, starting
low-fat
from this.
Typically, I think maybe we're missing. Low-fat typically means higher sugar.
Right. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at with all of this is that there seems to be an issue with research and industry funding in research. Mm-hmm. So there was response from the sugar industry. And
when?
Just recently. Well, this came out, so let's see if I can find it.
So we're talking about two different time periods here. First, you were talking about in the 50s and 60s when this article was published, and now we're skipping ahead. Is that what's going on?
Skipping ahead to now that we're talking about this review when the person found the secret letters,
mm-hmm. which don't seem to have been that secret if they were just in a library.
I think just no one had found them before.
Well, someone put them there. Who put them there?
I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. So that's another thing, and I mean, I guess that
she didn't explain where she found them.
No, she did. They're all cited in the article. I can't find the text because I don't think they're like online, but they're all cited in the article. And she said she found them in a university library in Colorado.
That even makes less sense. If they're in a library in Colorado, why aren't they in Harvard or?
I don't know.
Or why aren't they at? I figured they must be in San Francisco since that's where her and all her research is based. Or...
That's what she told NPR, that's where she found them.
Okay.
I don't know anything.
I have more questions than I did when we started.
Well, that's good because that's the point of this whole episode, I think. You should question. So what they ended up finding when this article came out in the New England Journal of Medicine mm-hmm. in the late 60s, mm-hmm. what they ended up doing was that they were very, very specific about which studies they included as reputable data. Mm-hmm. And so they only took what's called serum cholesterol levels. Mm-hmm. So looking at cholesterol in the blood, which was only being done in a small percentage of studies. It sounds like most people were looking at serum triglyceride levels when they were studying this heart disease. And so they decided that only the serum cholesterol levels would be included. And they did this likely to kind of negate all these other studies that were implicating sugar as a risk factor. Mm-hmm. So basically the point of this is that while maybe their statistical analysis was fine, their research methodology, and in this specific case, their inclusion criteria for studies in their review seemed to be a little suspect.
Yeah.
And so that's what led to this weird kind of result, and the result that was favorable to the sugar company.
Yeah.
So going into all this, the first thing I wanted to do, because...
we've been talking for like 20 minutes.
Well, I read this article.
Oh, okay.
And because...
You forgot to do it first.
Reading this article made me think, well, now I need to just question every article. And so I went, and this article does actually do a very good job of disclosing various things.
Which article?
The article that is citing these secret correspondence letters. The one that was just published in JAMA in mid-September.
Okay.
I thought it would be interesting to go look at their funding. Mm-hmm. And they mention all the places that they get money from. What I did think was interesting, actually, too, that I haven't seen in a lot of studies, is they broke down each different section of their study and said which author wrote it and which parts of it each author wrote, if two of them worked on a specific section.
Yeah, I have never seen that. I usually just I was referring to, usually on the front page or at the top of the article, it'll say something like, the authors have no declared conflict of interest, or this author is employed by such and such company that manufactures this device, or something like that. I usually don't see specific funding amounts or specific authors that wrote specific parts.
Yeah, these guys went all out, and they likely did it on purpose, since it's kind of the point of their article.
Yeah.
I was pleasantly surprised by that, but after I read this article, I kind of went searching for, well, this obviously can't be the first time this happened, and probably isn't the only time. And of course...
What do you mean, the first time what happened?
That there was some type of industry-funded research that was favorable for that industry.
Yeah.
So I went online and started just searching news articles, and I found that it was actually very easy to find news articles about industry-funded research. So I think now we'll talk about some of the examples that I found. There was one study last October 2015, that was funded by the Coca-Cola Company. So this study was, from what I can tell, the study looks like it was done in order to...
Are these peer-reviewed studies?
Yeah, they all are, of course.
Yeah.
So this study was funded by the Coca-Cola Company. When it came out, it seems like it was not funded by the Coca-Cola Company. They didn't mention that. And now when you find the article, it's the very top thing on the article says funded by the Coca-Cola Company, just before you can even get to the article. So this was looking at, they were trying to decide whether it was exercise or what they're calling lifestyle behaviors or diet in children, which are implicated as the greater risk factor for obesity in children. And what they report is that it's exercise. Then there's this ad campaign by Coca-Cola about how kids should exercise more, but that you can still have as much Coca-Cola as you want. So I think what all this is saying is that
a lot of sugar is bad for you. Why do they need to prove that it's not? It is. So stop trying to prove.
But it's not.
Okay
it's not that it's just the sugar people too.
Yeah.
It's probably everybody, and it's likely that that this type of thing, especially back in the 50s when this seemed to be first
smoking isn't
happening.
bad for you.
Well, there's an interesting connection there too that I read about. She said this Kearns researcher, who's the author of the JAMA paper.
Dentists probably have something to say about smoking too.
Probably. She said that the man that was in charge of the Sugar Administration when all this was happening, he ended up leaving the Sugar Administration and going to a tobacco lobbying group.
Yeah, he's a lobbyist, clearly.
So the tobacco industry probably learned from the sugar industry how to do this type of
I've had a challenge with
funding.
working with sugar, and now I'm going to really use what I've learned and move it to tobacco.
So what all this has come to is a lot of scientists now are calling for better transparency when it comes to your funding and
yes, of course,
and how the articles were written. So it brings me back to the JAMA article where they were very specific about which parts of the articles each author did. They said exactly which things their funding came from and which industries it might implicate. They mentioned there was one of the authors was implicated with tobacco, an organization that was main focus is looking at why tobacco is bad. Now, I don't think that's scientifically argued anymore, but at least it says probably what their spin on the research is, and I'm not sure if that's a spin at all, but
seems like a realistic spin. I don't know.
But it says what the goal of that organization was. And so a lot of scientists now are calling for this type of information to be in the abstract and above any of the information that actually comes out of the study.
It usually is above the abstract, isn't it?
No. In their paper, it's really at the bottom. So they're saying that instead of journalists being able to just look at an abstract, and see maybe you can usually see maybe author affiliations, but that just says where they work, right? So they want the funding implications and all that kind of stuff to be posted above.
I was just trying to pull up one of the articles from my last.
This kind of thing is changing too, but this is just another example of why it should change faster. And it's another example of, it seems that food research has been industry funded in one way or another for a long time, and it's really hard to know what type of food research is good. So I have one more silly example to tell you about that you may have heard of or not. So in May 2015, there was a journalist whose name is John Bohannon. So what he did was he conducted, in air quotes, a study about how eating chocolate could help you lose weight. And it was this really poorly designed study.
Just all chocolate all the time, or?
Yeah, you can read the study. I'll post it. He did a study, and his results found that, of course, he had these really poor methods and bad statistical analysis. His results found that eating chocolate helped you lose weight.
Yeah.
And he put out a press release and published the article, and there was tons and tons of media coverage of it. And then he came out and said, yeah, I made that whole thing up just to prove that.
Well, I did research, but I just did a bad method.
He said, I just to prove that we need to pay attention to the methods more. I don't want to put everything on journalists because, they have their own job to do.
But their job is not just to trust what's given to them. Their job is to investigate
right.
and then share the important information with their audience.
So
their job is not to repeat whatever anyone says to them.
Right. So I think if you're reading any food research, whether it be a media outlet reporting on it or whether it be the journal article from the scientists themselves,
don't necessarily trust it hasn't been
you need to be
influenced.
even more skeptical than you would be for a normal research article, which you already need to be skeptical for.
Which explains a lot to me, because I think one thing that's people maybe even make fun of a little bit regarding food research is they say, like, wine is bad for you, don't drink wine. Wine is healthy for you, drink wine every day. Like, people are just like, whatever, eat what you want.
Too.
Yeah, chocolate, eggs. People said don't eat very many eggs. Only 1 egg per week or something.
Right. It's
and
very
now
confusing.
It says eat as many eggs as you want, which is good because I like to have eggs for breakfast every day. So what that tells me is not that there isn't clear answers available, but maybe that people are just doing studies with poor methods or being influenced by the egg lobby or whatever, the wine lobby.
I don't know. Honestly, I feel like we don't have the whole story here because I would find it hard to believe that there aren't some, nutritional scientists that are doing the right thing, are doing good research and trying to figure out, what is good for you to eat and not. But it doesn't seem like...
Maybe those are not the flashy articles that get published and make a splash in the media.
And while we do know some stuff about nutrition, it always just comes back to, people say, oh, well, eat vegetables, eat non-processed foods. And you're like, well, that's not specific at all, really.
Yeah.
So,
and is that, it makes sense to me, but is that just a common knowledge recommendation, or is that based on research?
Right?
I don't know.
So it seems weird because I would find it hard to believe that all, nutritional scientists are falling for these types of issues, but we also don't seem to have any type of real knowledge in the field that is like easily accessible that
it's
they're doing
clearly,
that isn't clearly full of issues like all these other studies. I think
funding is always funding for areas that maybe are not. Funding is always a tricky thing for researchers. They have to get funding in order to be able to conduct research, and a lot of universities have high expectations placed on their researchers for how much money they bring in for their studies. So I can see where someone would be tempted.
Perhaps this is a much larger issue than just food industry.
Yeah.
But
maybe the whole setup of how the research system works.
Yeah. But I thought it was interesting.
It is. Yeah.
And
which makes me just
another reason to read your articles more carefully.
Maybe pay attention to
not just read the conclusion and move on.
Yeah, pay attention to your health and try and make...
Well, I don't even know how to make a food recommendation. A nutritional recommendation. It doesn't seem possible. Although there are people that do that for their jobs, so...
Speak to them and not us.
Yes. Well, that's always our recommendation.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess that's it. If you enjoyed the episode... please share us with a friend or give us a rating on iTunes.
You can visit our website, placebopodcast.com, for our show notes or to send us any suggestions or feedback.
You can also find us on Facebook.
Thank you to James Aiken for our music.
And thank you to everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Bye.
Goodbye.